the Open University traces the surprising origins of the Church of Orsan Michele in Florence.
The Church of Orsan Michele is unlike any other in Florence. It's unusual not just in the way it looks, but also in its history. The story of Orsan Michele gives us an insight into more than the building itself. It tells us something about the values and aspirations of ordinary people in 14th century Florence. From the very beginning, Orsan Michele was a mixture of the secular and the religious. It's an odd shape for a church, and its 3 stories make it look more like a palazzo. From a distance, you might not even guess it was a church at all. But decorating the outside are some of the most celebrated 15th and 16th century religious statues in Florence. Inside, it's rather dark and gloomy. But what draws the visitor today is the magnificent tabernacle created by the great artist Andrea Orcagna. It's carved from marble and a quite breathtaking piece of work. Everywhere it's covered in figures and ornament, which were designed to instruct, delight, and even intrigue the onlooker. But in the 14th century, it was the image of the Virgin which drew visitors. Pilgrims came here not just to marvel at the work of a great artist, but more importantly, because they believed the image worked miracles. But the history of Orsan Michele begins before the tabernacle. It's a strange and fascinating story, which meant that by the middle of the 14th century, Orsan Michele wasn't just an important church, but a kind of crossroads, where the religious and secular life of Florence were brought together. The full name, Orto San Michele, meant Garden of St. Michael, and comes from a small green area by the site of the original church. The present building stands strategically placed right in the heart of Florence. From its upper windows, you can see the secular center of Florentine life, the Palazzo dei Priori, and its religious center, the Duomo. In a way, the position reflects its dual role as a religious and secular building. Originally, this site wasn't meant for a church at all. The building, with its vast upper rooms, had a quite different function.
The building itself was designed to contain and to accommodate 3 different important activities that had evolved over the site before the present building went up. Probably the most important of these originally was the fact that it was on the site of a grain market. Before the present building had been erected, there had been a very much simpler grain loggia that was used for the selling of grain, and it protected both the grain and the merchants who were there. So originally the building, which had an open loggia, was meant to replace that.
It's impossible to know what the original grain loggia would have looked like, but these illustrations from the Libro del Bieduolo do give us some idea what the activities of the market would have been like. It was a busy commercial centre, quite unlike its present role as a church. It remained like this for the first half of the 14th century. Its upper rooms were part of this commercial role.
It also was meant to serve as the city's granary. And so the second story was meant as a granary. And that was an extremely important function because at the time when Orsan Michele was built in 1336, they needed to store grain for about 5 months out of the 12 in order to feed its population. Also, the third story, we assume, or one of the two upper stories, was meant to house the grain officials, who had, again, a quite important function. They were the people who regulated how much grain came in from places that had been imported, how much communal grain was released to the grain market, and they could supervise whether things would become chaotic or there might be riots because of lack of grain down below. So it had those three, let's say, economic functions.
You can still see plenty of evidence of its former commercial function. This emblem is a staio, which was the measure of grain used in 14th century Florence. When the grain arrived from the surrounding farms, it was hauled up through this shaft in the ceiling. The sacks would have been brought up through a small opening in the floor and then would have been stored in the granary. On the piers, there are these small openings. When city officials came to release the communal grain, they would send down small measured quantities through a chute in the pier itself. In times of famine, this became an essential security measure. Officials would regulate the amounts of grain sent down at any one time. The rest remained securely locked away above. This protected the grain in times of famine when there might be riots. If you look at the exterior on the corner of the building, you can just make out the remains of carvings which depicted the different seasons of the year. It's quite easy to see where the original arches of the loggia have been filled in. In the first half of the 14th century, this would have been an open loggia, similar perhaps to the Loggia dei Priori in the Piazza della Signoria. Far from the solid building we see now, the building would have been open on all sides. This was a public place, open to anybody, and a key commercial centre. But from the beginning, it had always had a second role.
It also had a very, very strong devotional function because the original loggia, the original grain loggia, had an image of the Virgin Mary, and in 1292, about 6 or 7 years after the earlier loggia had been built, this image of the Madonna began to work miracles, and it became the most important miracle-working site in Florence at that time. So that when the present Orsan Michele was built, they wanted to save part of the grain loggia, one bay out of the 6 bays, for devotion to this very important cult image.
Unusually, there's also a second altar in Orsan Michele. This is the altar to St. Anne, the Virgin's mother. The sculpture there now is 16th century, but from the middle of the 14th century, there had always been a small portable altar. St. Anne was credited with helping the commune expel the Duke of Athens. In 1343, he had unsuccessfully attempted to foist on Florence his own tyrannical rule. It was, however, the image of the Madonna which was most important, and accounts of her miracles were well documented at the time.
The contemporary chronicler Giovanni Villani says that she cured the sick, she managed to make the mentally ill whole again, and the result of this was that an enormous cult grew up around the Madonna. The people, according to Villani, from all over Florence, all over Tuscany, came to her in order to worship her and left money with her.
The present image of the Virgin was painted by Bernardo Dardi in 1347. It's a panel painting, and in fact it's the third miracle-working image of the Virgin at Or San Michele. It may seem strange to us that a replacement image could have the same miracle-working properties as the original, but medieval Florentines had no such reservations. The more beautiful and finely worked the image, the more gold and expensive material used, the more it would honor the Virgin and Christ.
When we first think about Or San Michele and even think about the site and the earlier grain market, it may seem very peculiar to us that there was an image of the Virgin in a grain market, in and on a loggia. And also, again, equally strange that she was preserved in the present building. However, if we go back and start looking into medieval theology, we find that there are very close connections with the idea of Mary as being the fertile earth, the virgin but fertile earth, who produced Christ, who was conceived of or thought about as the holy grain, who then would be ground up into making the communion wafer. So, in fact, there is an enormous amount of iconography that relates Christ and Mary to grain and to the functions of the grain market, and even to a granary. I mean, Mary is often talked about as being the granary that housed Christ, just as she sometimes is talked about as being the tabernacle that housed Christ. And another way of looking at the Orcagna tabernacle would be to see it as an image of Mary as the tabernacle, with Christ as the center of that.
The job of caring for this precious image lay with the confraternity of Or San Michele. Confraternities were a little like modern-day masons. They were lay institutions, but like the building itself, they also had dual religious and social functions.
Confraternities, which were found throughout late medieval Europe, were essentially organizations which provided the members with an ability to develop their own devotion, and also at the same time enabled them to provide a system of social services, i.e. a certain amount of alms if they were ill, or also free burial. And the commemorative side was obviously something that was very important. All these fraternities were dedicated to a patron saint, or saints, such as Mary, Francis, or quite often attached to the patron saint of the local church.
Membership of a confraternity conferred social and religious prestige. During Masses, the laity was normally divided off from the altar and the sacrifice of the Mass, and were kept behind huge rood screens. But, as this fresco shows, privileged laity was sometimes allowed to join clerics on the altar side. Joining a confraternity could give you this kind of privilege. There were different kinds of confraternities. The flagellant confraternities wore distinctive clothing and hid their faces, and were devoted to penitence, often achieved by beating or whipping themselves. Paying homage to the Virgin was the most important aspect of a second type of confraternity, the Laudesi. They would sing hymns or lauds in front of painted images of the Virgin. Duccios celebrated Rucellai Madonna was commissioned by the largest Laudesi confraternity, which was attached to the Dominican convent of Santa Maria Novella in Florence.
After the Laudesi and the Flagellant companies, one has the phenomenon of the large charitable fraternities, in which I would probably put the Company of the Madonna of San Michele. These were, before the emergence of the welfare state, among the main organizations which provided charity to the poor in late medieval and early modern southern Europe. Orto San Michele, though, was rather a curious example, because it combines, on the one hand, an important charity, with, on the other hand, a very important Laudesi company. And indeed, it's recently been called the most important Laudesi company because it produced the largest income in order to be able to employ a large number of singers and musicians in its chapels in the late 14th and early 15th century.
The Confraternity of Orto San Michele was established in 1291. It is very remarkable, almost as remarkable as the building which later was built on the site, in that, unlike a lot of other Florentine confraternities, it was a completely lay institution. It had no ties with any particular church in Florence. Instead, it seems to have been organized spontaneously by the people in and around the market, probably grain merchants, but even poorer people who would come to buy their grain there, to sing lauds to the image of the Virgin. And in fact, a year after they organized the confraternity, the Virgin then began to work her miracles. By this event, the confraternity became increasingly more popular and also very wealthy, because every time that the Virgin performed a miracle, the people would reward her by making donations. And soon, the confraternity of Orto San Michele became the city's most important confraternity.
Now, obviously, at a certain point, the fraternity had the problem as to know what to do with the money. And the most obvious solution was to provide alms to the poor. If you look at the bottom of this illumination, you can see three people slouched against the counter where the candles are bought and sold. And these three particular images are representations of three different types of people who are actually helped by the fraternity. On the right-hand side, you've got an image of a pregnant woman. The other two, one of them, as far as one can see, is a blind man and the other a cripple. So you have the devotional side and you have the charitable side.
This charitable role was more than symbolic. It had a very real importance. This illumination depicts the market in 1329, a time of great famine and rioting. The government of Florence, or commune as it was called, often used the local militia to put down disorder. They would also give out grain to the needy, which it had stored in the granary. But the poor of Florence also depended very much on the charity of the confraternity.
The public also became more enamored with the role of the fraternity from then onwards. They began leaving more and more alms, they began leaving more and more bequests to the fraternity. So that by the late 1330s, the fraternity was in fact the single most affluent charitable organization in the whole of Florence.
While the confraternity had responsibility for the holy image, two other lay bodies influenced the history of the building itself. One was the guilds, the other was the commune. Again, they combined the religious and secular functions.
The commune played an absolutely fundamental role in the establishment of Orto San Michele. The entire building was built with communal funds. And to finance this, the communal funds that were used were taxes, indirect taxes on the merchants who used the area in the loggia and around the loggia for grain itself. There was a tax on the bags that you stored grain in. There was a tax each time you ground flour. There were about 5 different taxes that initially should have provided the building with enough funds to get it up very quickly. So that's one function. 2 years after the building is started, you then have one of the main guilds, in fact the guild that was in charge of supervising the work of Orsan Michele, commissioning or making a petition to the commune that all 12 important guilds, the 5 major guilds and the 7 middle guilds of the city, be asked to decorate the external piers of the open loggia with patron saints that belong to their own guilds.
St. John was the patron saint of the Silk Guild, which was responsible for supervising the work on Orsan Michele. Their emblem of a gate, known as Por San Maria, would have been easily recognizable in the 14th century. The statues and most of the decoration weren't completed until the 15th century, but there are still a few contemporary niches. In the frieze below, 15th century relief carvings depict the lives of the saints. They also reflect the work of the guild. This is the guild of masons and woodcarvers. The Farriers Guild. Some of the emblems had religious as well as secular significance. The Lamb of God represented the Wool Guild. Their patron saint was St. Stephen. On the feast day of their saint, the guild members would process to their image and leave money and offerings, increasing the funds available to the confraternity.
This had a remarkable effect because it transformed Orsan Michele into a very important civic and political center as well. I mean, as you know, the guilds are were terribly important in the formation of the government. You had to be a guild member in order to become a prior. And by honoring the guilds at Orsan Michele, in fact, the political system of the time was also being honored and paid homage to.
Orsan Michele had become a complex focal point for the city. It was a civic center, important to the guilds. It still housed the granary and was an important economic center. Its devotional side was also important. The miracles attributed to Mary meant that more and more pilgrims were attracted to Orsan Michele to pray before the image of the Virgin. They came not just from Florence, but also from the surrounding areas. Consequently, the confraternity, which was responsible for dispensing the money donated, became an important social institution. In 1348, however, the Black Death and its disastrous effects on the population changed the course of the history of the building. The bubonic plague killed over half the population of Florence. Contemporary chroniclers wrote about the impact on Orsan Michele.
The fraternity of Orsan Michele became incredibly enriched by the bequests that had been left to it in order to distribute to charity. They said that the reputation of the fraternity, was so great that everybody believed that it should be left money to include it in continue its good work. What this meant, in effect, was that the fraternity had to decide what to do with an enormous sum of money. Villani says that it was equivalent, and he should know because he in fact was one of the treasurers at the time of the commune, that it was equivalent to the income of the commune.
This vast increase in wealth helped tip the balance in favor of the devotional aspect of the building. The tabernacle is the most lasting evidence of the confraternity's wealth and power. It was commissioned in 1352 to give thanks for deliverance from the plague. Orcagna was already acknowledged by his contemporaries as one of the greatest artists of the time. but the scale and grandeur of the tabernacle was unprecedented. One of the reasons it had to be so grand was that, in effect, it was in the open. When the tabernacle was planned, the loggia was still open on all sides, so it had to be large enough for pilgrims to see it from some distance. But its main function was to provide an enormously elaborate, very expensive frame for a miraculous image. But the tabernacle also had a practical purpose. It was a kind of storage space for donations made to the image. If you walk round behind the tabernacle, you can see a tiny door which is almost hidden behind the later iron railings. The door is no more than 3 foot high. The officials of the confraternity would have had to crawl through this door on their hands and knees to get inside. The small passage took them under the painting, into the well, in front of the holy image. There's also a tiny staircase below the painting, which spirals up behind the image. This was to allow access to the top dome, which housed the mechanisms for closing the gate, which shielded the image when it wasn't on view.
The shrine had to accommodate a series of functions. It had to be a secure place. It had to enable 2 functionaries to sit inside it, but not to have the general public be able to get on the inside of the shrine. And this was in order to protect the offerings so that nothing happened to them, they wouldn't be stolen. Because the offerings consisted not only of wax, but sometimes of clothing, of elaborate funeral vestments that were put over the coffins and were called drapeloni, and also of monetary offerings.
The tabernacle was the most expensive piece of work of its kind. Everywhere it's lavishly ornamented. The work is remarkably intricate. The colors are rich and vibrant, and the effect is breathtaking. Hidden behind the railings are carved panels which run right round the base of the tabernacle. It's very difficult now to see the carvings, as the ordinary visitor isn't allowed behind the iron grille. But the reliefs are quite extraordinary in the quality of work and their attention to detail. The panels take us through key points in the life of the Virgin. Her birth, the Annunciation by the Archangel Gabriel that she was to be the mother of Christ, and the Nativity. The idea was to pay homage to the life of the Virgin. It was also to instruct visitors. Pilgrims would take spiritual comfort from the stories of Mary's life. The panels are punctuated by carvings of the 7 Christian virtues. Again, this would instruct the pilgrim on virtues they might seek to acquire for themselves. Charity, justice, fortitude, faith, and hope. The carvings continue right round to the back of the tabernacle, where we're shown scenes from the end of Mary's life. An angel announces her death. The figures are solemnly expressive. Finally, the magnificent carving on the back of the tabernacle is the scene of the death of the Virgin and her enthronement into heaven. It's the culmination of the work and represents the most glorious moment in the story of the Madonna. The sculpted relief of Mary's death is perhaps the most crowded scene of all. The serenity of the Virgin in death contrasts with the grief on the face of the onlookers and in their gestures. The reliefs on the back and around the base tell a story. But as well as the figurative carving, there's a lot of decoration and ornament. But again, this decoration had a purpose.
Ornament clearly meant a great deal to the observer in the 14th century. We probably should be a little cautious in the extent to which we read meanings into it. Clearly, the scallop as a pilgrim badge was important. Clearly, the stars set in the vault of the tabernacle itself were of significance. As you know, the documents quite often, when they talk of a ceiling, for example, like the starry firmament of the Arena Chapel, they often talk of a cielo. The word for ceiling and sky is effectively identical.
The ribs of the vault are formed by what are known as twisted barley sugar columns. These had antique associations. They resembled descriptions of the decoration in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. The techniques were enormously sophisticated, as the marble was actually inlaid with semi-precious stones. Just as with the painting, the more money spent, the more you honored the Virgin and Christ. The more intricate and difficult the work, the more prestige was conferred on the donor. The process involved in the carving of the reliefs was just as sophisticated.
The relief would, in the first instance, be roughly worked with a heavy point or chisel, and then the sculptor would remove layer after layer, almost like onion skins, with various kinds of claw chisels of varying degrees of fineness. And these, in the end, would be, again, removed with abrasives. And the extraordinarily sensitive transitions between drapery and skin, between soft objects, hands on balustrades and things of this kind, the tool marks would be removed finally with abrasives, which is why we have this extraordinarily fluent modeling in so many of these reliefs.
The tabernacle was completed in 1359, and it remains even today the most important piece of sculpture of its kind in Florence. But it wasn't just through sculpture and painting that the confraternity honored the Virgin. They were a Laudesi confraternity, and every evening members would sing hymns to the Virgin. So music became an important part of the life of Or San Michele.
I think that if one can piece together, like a jigsaw puzzle, all the disparate pieces of evidence about musical performance in Florence, all these pieces build up a picture of Or San Michele being the principal musical centre and the principal point of access that ordinary people may have had to not only liturgical music, but popular religious music like the Laude, and also with the versions of secular songs, when they put louder texts to them, ordinary people would hear this very sophisticated music, which otherwise would have been performed only for the elite in Florence.
Laude were songs sung in praise of the Virgin and saints. They were sung in Italian and sometimes put to the music of a popular secular song. In this way, the laity could join in the service. Again, there was this mixture of secular and religious.
The Lauda service was, if you like, a layman's way of participating in a devotion that was not, strictly speaking, a liturgical service. After all, the liturgy at that time was for the clerics. The clerics said Mass, they chanted the office, but with the Lauda service, the Laudarium, that is the book that collected the Laude, of which only 2 survive intact, these were collections of vernacular texts with music, and so this was the layman's answer.
From the beginning of the 14th century, the confraternity paid for singers and instrumentalists to perform lauds each evening in front of the image of the Virgin. There were also special services on feast days.
Those who were paid for their performance to sing the Laude were not usually professional singers in the modern sense, even though some of the instrumentalists were professional musicians in the modern sense. And I think that this is still a common practice today, and not many singers can earn a living just from singing, especially singers of ecclesiastical music.
As well as lauds, there were other types of music. These were the suonatori, or players of loud instruments.
The suonatori included the trombadori, and also the players of the trompetti, and the pifferi, the players of wind instruments, which were mostly shawms. These were paid by the signoria to provide entertainment at formal banquets, to announce new legislation, for example, to precede the herald who had to announce new laws. But as part of their salary, they were obligated to perform every Sunday in front of the picture of the Virgin Mary in Or San Michele.
The performance of both the suonatori and the performance of lauds was something of a spectacle. For instance, the instrumentalists would dress up as angels to perform. Once the Orcagna tabernacle had been built, it was almost like a piece of theatre.
I think it's quite likely that they sang from inside the balustrade that separates the people from the image itself. There's enough room for the number of singers that we know were being salaried at that time. Now, the balustrade is high enough to conceal the musicians from the sight of many of those who are there, and carved into the marble are 6 musical angels. And it's possible that this may have created the illusion, if one wanted to indulge in such illusions, that the music was being produced by the angels who were drawing aside the veil which, from the very beginning, had covered the painting of the Virgin Mary.
By the second half of the 14th century, the balance between the secular and devotional had shifted. Or San Michele had become much more of a religious site. Within a few years of completing the tabernacle, the confraternity asked the commune to remove the grain market, which by then seemed indecorous next to such a magnificent shrine. In 1387, the arches of the open loggia were filled in. The building was no longer open on all sides, but closed in and less accessible. It also provided opportunity for yet more decoration. On the exterior, there was extensive tracery. Inside, too, decoration continued.
In the late 1380s and throughout the 1390s, there were 2 very interesting developments that took place. The first concerns a whole cycle of glass that was done for the windows on the top of the tracery for the arch infills. And the Trecento, the late Trecento glass for this part of the church is very remarkable because it consists of various miracles from the miracles of the Virgin. The miracles of the Virgin circulated in a number of manuscripts, and there are enormous collections. You can have 50, you can have more than 50. And whoever selected them seems to have selected ones that would go or would be appropriate to the actual setting of Or San Michele. As Franco Sacchetti, the great late Trecento storyteller and poet, was in charge of a lot of the decoration at Or San Michele beginning in 1387, it seems highly likely that he would have designed the iconographical program for the stained glass, just as it was his idea to put a railing around the tabernacle itself upon which candles could be placed so that the tabernacle could be illuminated in a better way and people could see that.
The guilds, too, continued their contribution. They commissioned painted images of their patron saints on the pillars inside the church, and they'd compete for the best position next to the holy image. Just as with the exteriors, a frieze below the image reflected the saint's life and the work of the guild members. The Bankers' Guild had St. Matthew as their patron saint. They also continued to work on the outside of the building, commissioning more and more elaborate tabernacles, which in the following century would hold statues of their saints. However, by the late 14th century, the relationship between the various lay bodies began to deteriorate. The enormous popularity of the miraculous image had given the confraternity immense wealth and immense power in their role as dispensers of charity. But in the years following the Black Death, the importance of charity as a means of social control began to decline. and with it the power of the confraternities. The commune, however, continued to flourish, and they began to challenge the confraternities.
And what happened was that the priors of the commune decided partly that they wanted to get their hands on some of this cash, but partly also they had heard rumours, how true they were, we don't know because the records are not really good enough, that there had been corruption within the fraternity. Now, what this meant, in fact, was that one of the results of this was that the priors of the commune stepped in and over the next 10, 20 years took over the administration. But at that point, in 1348, the priors of the commune decided that the captains were not worthy to administer all this money by themselves. And what they meant by corruption was that they were actually feathering each other's nests. That the captains were told that they were providing money to their friends, to their relatives, and the money was not going to proper pious causes, not to proper charitable ends.
Also, we have to remember that in the early 14th century, when the population of Florence was about 90,000, the number of indigent and also people who required charity was enormous. When a lot of them, unfortunately, died off in the plague, there was no longer the same need for the same type of charity, and so the confraternity itself underwent a transformation and ultimately became less important in Florentine life. The site continued to remain important even as the confraternity itself began to go into eclipse because of the fact that the guilds had their tabernacles on the outside, and they remained important in Florentine history really right up through certainly the period of the Medici coming in the early 15th century, but also, and perhaps more importantly, because of the altar of St. Anne. She had been a particularly important communal heroine, and she remained so, and as new communal saints became important to Florence, a large number of them would also receive an image in the Church of Orsan Michele. So what we see is a gradual transformation with the commune and the guilds taking a more important role and the confraternity gradually fading out as the commune found other ways to deal with the problem of charity.
Today, Orsan Michele is still one of the most important churches in Florence. The guild statues on the exterior attract hordes of visitors. But its fascination lies buried in its history. We're only left with fragments of the past. But even with just a few pieces, we can still build up a vivid picture of this strange combination of the secular and religious.